Hello friends, are you bored of playing the same 4 chords all the time? Do you feel as though every jazz standard that you play kinda sounds exactly the same? We need a little spice in your life, and that spice is what we call chord substitutions. Let's look at 5 different ones. Throughout this video, we're going to predominantly be looking at a 2-5-1 progression, and if you're unfamiliar with that progression, which is one of the most common ones that we see in Western music, I'm going to link to my video here that explains those and gives you some exercises to really internalize them in the key of C across the fingerboard. Now, when we talk about chord substitutions, it's really all in the name. We're taking one chord that may or may not be in the key that we're working in, and we're going to substitute that for a common chord. So for our purposes, we're going to be working over our 2-5 progression in C. We're going to start on a D minor 7th for one measure, and then a G 7th for one measure, resolving to C. And we're going to look at different ways that we can accomplish this same resolution. One of the easiest chord substitutions to look at is our diminished 7th sub. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take our G 7th chord, our dominant chord, and we're going to replace that with a diminished 7th chord, which will sound like this. So what's happening here and why does it sound okay? You can hear that still leads our ear to that C and gives us the resolution that we want, but there's a little bit more tension. We're adding a bit more dissonance to the sound. So if we look at our G 7th chord, we have G, B, D, and F. Those are the notes that we have in our G 7th chord. And if we look at our B diminished 7th chord, which is our 7 chord, our only naturally occurring diminished 7th chord in the key of C, we can see that we have the notes B, D, F, which we already said are part of the G 7th chord, and then we have an A flat as our diminished 7th in that. So this is really a G 7th chord, but we're just omitting the G and replacing it with an A flat. That little half step movement, which then when we resolve to C, resolves down to a G. So we still get that nice sense of resolution. Now the other good part about a diminished 7th substitution is that on uke we can just slide these on up the neck to provide even more movement to it. So I can go from D minor 7th to B diminished 7th and then slide that on up to our next voicing of it and use that so we can use these movable diminished 7th chords all over the neck. Let's look at our next chord substitution. Now our next substitution is probably the most commonly used one in both jazz and classical music. This is not actually just used compositionally in jazz. This far predates that genre of music. And that's what's called the tritone substitution. Now first we need to figure out what a tritone is. And a tritone is a sharp 4 or a flat 5, depending how you want to look at it. So we're going to take, if we are in the key of C major, we know C is our root, so we count up C, D, E, F, G, then we just bring it down a half step. So a half step away from a G is F sharp. So that would be an F sharp would be our tritone. We can think of this as the introduction to The Simpsons. So once we're able to find a tritone, then we need to figure out, well, how do we substitute one of these chords for something else? And the tritone sub comes in place of a dominant 7th chord. And in our progression, we have D minor 7th, G 7th, there's our dominant chord. So it's going to replace our G 7th chord, but we're going to find the tritone in here. So the 5th of our G 7th chord is a D, so it's going to be a D flat 7th, or a C sharp 7th. Doesn't really matter what you call it. And it's always going to be substituted as a different dominant 7th chord. So it'll now be a D flat dominant 7th, replacing our G 7th. Sounds like this. It still gives us our sense of motion to a C major chord, but it's a slightly different sound that we have. But why does this work? That's the question, because a D flat 7th really makes no sense in the key of C whatsoever. But we have a couple fun things going on here. Remember, if we look at our G 7th chord, we have G, B, D, and F, right? And our D 7th chord, we have D flat, F, A flat, C flat, which seems like a lot. But if we think of where these notes actually lay out on here, well, our C flat is just a B. That's shared with our G7th chord. The F is another common tone with our shared G7th chord. But even more than this, the F and the B, as we see them in a G7th chord, are what we call leading tones or guide tones. They're getting us someplace. The B is the third of the chord, telling us whether it's major or minor, the quality. And then the F is our seventh, which is giving us that sense of needing to go somewhere. So we're saving these two tones from the G7th chord and changing the other notes in here. And in addition to that, this D flat that we have is a half step away from our C, and our ears like to hear half and whole step movement. We want those notes to be close to each other. So although a D flat seventh doesn't necessarily make sense all the time, it actually gets us just where we need to go. And tritone substitutions and understanding them will get you pretty far in understanding jazz harmony as well. The next chord substitution we have is what's called the Backdoor 2-5-1. I'm going to play it for you real quick. It sounds like this. So in here, that gets us to the C major chord in a very different harmonic way. And what we're doing here is we're borrowing chords from C minor to get us to C major. And what we're doing is we're going to actually go a little bit backwards here. We're going to replace our G7th with a B flat seventh, with a flat 7 chord in our key. Now, why does this work? Well, again, it comes down to common tones. And whenever we're talking about substitutions, no matter what kind it is, we're generally going to have common tones between the chord that we start with and the chord we're substituting for. We need to maintain some of those qualities. In the case of our G7th, we're keeping the D and the F are both also in our B flat 7th chord. So we have those tones getting us to the C. In addition to this, we can take it even one step further and also replace the 2 chord, our D minor 7th. What we'll do is we'll replace this with a F minor 7th chord, which would be our 2 chord in relation to this B flat here. That would be a 2-5, thinking we're going to E flat, but actually bringing us to C. So our Backdoor 2-5-1 is something that's actually used quite a lot in jazz music and is great to get under your belt. But ultimately, all we're doing is we're taking a flat 7 chord in a dominant form and substituting it for our 5-7 chord, giving us a different sense of tension to get back to our tonic. Now next, let's look at a nice easy one. This is a secondary dominant. A secondary dominant is simply taking the 5 chord of whatever chord we're going to. So our G7th is the 5 chord in relation to C. It brings us back to C. But this D minor 7th, we can actually make this a D7th, D dominant 7th. And why does that work? Well, how does D7th relate to our G7th? It's the 5 chord, right? G, A, B, C, D. That's just our dominant chord, and we're borrowing it from the chord we're targeting to give a stronger sense of motion. So I'm going to play our regular 2-5, and then I'm going to go back and play this 2-5 with the secondary dominant 7th in it so that you can hear the difference between these two. So it gets us to the same spot, but in a brighter sort of way. Now, what if we took a couple of these individual concepts and threw them all together? We would come up with this chromatic sort of 2-5-1. So what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that we just replaced that D minor 7th with a D7th, our secondary dominant, right? But then, if we recall back to earlier in the video, we know we can take a dominant chord and we can do a tritone substitution on here. So what would be our tritone substitution for a D7th chord? We count up to our 5th scale degree, right? D, E, F, G, A, and make it flat. So we would play an A flat 7th, getting us to a G7th. And that would be our tritone sub for our secondary dominant, which is called taking everything one step too far. And it sounds like this. Gets us a nice resolution. But since we're here, let's take it one step further. Let's make this a series of 2-5-1 progressions. So preceding this A flat 7th, we're going to put that relative 2 chord here. So we're going to use an E flat minor 7th to A flat 7th. But then we're going to shove the whole regular 2-5-1 into the second bar. So we're going to play E flat minor 7th to A flat 7th, D minor 7th to G7th, resolving to C. We can see the way that this walks down. This is why we call it a chromatic 2-5-1. It's coming down in half steps. It's going to sound like this. So these are just 5 options that we can use to replace some of these especially dominant chords to give a different sort of feeling in the movement of the harmony. But since you've stuck around this long, I'm going to give you a bonus substitution that is my absolute favorite. This final chord substitution you have likely played many times before. This crops up in songs such as I'll See You in My Dreams, All of Me, Sin to Tell a Lie, I Can't Believe That You're in Love with Me, and a host of others. What we're going to do here is instead of a D minor 7th, we're going to play an F 6th chord. We're going to take our 4 chord in the key of C, and we're going to add the 6th scale degree, which in this case is a D to it, which gives us, well, it's just a D minor 7th the way that it lays out on uke. But we're going to think of this as an F 6th. We're going to pretend that a bass player is playing an F underneath of us. And from this, we're going to go to an F minor 6th. So all we're doing is removing this A to an A flat. We get a sound like this. Now, why does this work? And it's really, again, for a host of reasons. The F6th makes total sense because it's just a D minor 7th in different clothes. A different tonic is all. But the F minor 6th is a very unique chord. So A, we're sharing this D and F with our G7th, right? We always want to maintain some of those common tones from the chord that we're substituting in. Now the A flat we've added to a few other chords in these substitutions, right? Our B flat 7th, as well as our diminished sub, also has an A flat here, so we're close to that. And then we're maintaining this C, which is the tonic that we're targeting. So we have common tones from the 1 chord, the diminished 7th, and our G7th in here. So many of the ways that we can get to the 1 chord are contained in this F minor 6th chord. But the cool part about the F minor 6th chord is it's what we call a negative harmony substitution for our G7th chord. If we took all of the intervals in a G7th chord and flipped them upside down, they would contain simply an F minor 6th chord. So we're actually inverting all of the intervals and making a negative harmony dominant chord, which is an absolutely ridiculous and beautiful thing that we see all over the place in commonplace harmony. So here's our 4 to a 4 minor 6, resolving to 1. So there it is. In fact, 6 substitutions for a 2-5-1. Now I know this is a whole lot to digest in one video. So if you hop on over to my Patreon, I have all of these written out for you in context of chord progressions, because really the key to this is understanding functionally how they work, but also being able to hear them and knowing when they're going to sound okay in a progression. I'll see you all next week.